Hudson Bay Mission, Missionary John Horden's 42 Years Among the Cree and Eskimo. Written by Augustus Buckland, author of The Heroic in Missions. Audiobook, produced by scrollreader.com. We've taken the 7th edition and revised it in 2025 for easier readability. Originally published in 1894. Dedicated to Mrs. Horden, for many years the faithful companion in her husband's missionary work. Note by the author. For the material in this biography, I am indebted to Bishop Horden's letters published in the periodicals and reports of the Church Missionary Society, and in the record, to the book 42 Years Amongst the Indians and Eskimo, compiled by the editor of the Choral magazine from letters sent to her, to the account of Bishop Horden in brief sketches of Church Missionary Society workers, and to information given to me privately. Chapter 1. A Boy's Ambition. It is hard to find a healthy, intelligent boy who does not, sooner or later, decide what he would like to be. Sometimes he chooses something unsuitable or decides under the influence of a passing interest. Sometimes his ambition cannot be fulfilled. But these things do not keep most boys from trying to choose for themselves. The missionary bishop whose story this book tells was one of those who decided early. He also found that other people's ideas for his future did not match his own. Yet he belongs among those boys who, disappointed at first, later saw their dream come true. As a child, John Horden resolved, God willing, to be a missionary. At first he faced opposition and disappointment, but in time his desire was granted, and he lived and died as a missionary in one of the hardest fields known to the modern evangelist. Horden stands as an example of lifelong devotion to a single purpose. This sets him apart from many of the best-known mission workers. William Carey was 33 when he volunteered as a missionary, and before that had run a shop with a signboard reading "Second-hand shoes bought and sold," before becoming a schoolmaster and preacher. Adoniram Judson had chased many dreams, taught school, and even traveled with an acting troupe before the turning point that led him to follow God and become a missionary. Allen Gardner was a naval officer, strongly drawn to naval service from childhood before taking up mission work in Zululand and making the heroic attempt that led to his death in Tierra del Fuego. To give more recent examples, Dr. John G. Peyton preached faithfully at home before being called to his remarkable mission in the South Seas. Bishop Hannington, who became a martyr, was called from a rural parish. Alexander Mackay left engineering. Mr. Monroe, formerly head of the Metropolitan Police Force, left a well-earned retirement, and many others, unknown to the world, left secular work to serve among non-Christians abroad. Some young people decide early what they want to be, but after trying it, realize they were wrong and turn to something else. Many boys, inspired by thrilling sea stories, decide to become sailors and insist on it, despite warnings. But for many, a single voyage is enough to show them that they are completely unsuited to life at sea. Those who learn this before it is too late are spared the unhappiness of being a round man in a square hole. It was different with John Horden. He chose early, stayed constant, and in the work he had decided upon, he lived out his days and died in old age. John Horden was born in Exeter in 1828, the eldest son of William and Sarah Horden. His father worked as a printer, and the family lived in humble circumstances. Still, his parents were devout Christians, and even though they had their own ideas about mission work, they helped shape their son's path. At 7 years old, John entered St. John's School in Exeter, a charity founded back in the 12th century. In Horden's day, the school supported orphans and other children by giving them food, clothing, education, and training for a useful life. There, John was under Christian influence, and he accepted Christ as his Savior. Some people doubt the sincerity of childhood faith, claiming it will not last. But many steady, consistent lives have started with a child's conscious choice to serve God, and John Horden is one such example. His childhood convictions stayed with him into adulthood. In the 1830s and 1840s, there were not many books about foreign missions in a form easily read by the public. Mission efforts were fewer, less supported, and less talked about than today, when names like Livingston, Patterson, Hannington, Gilmore, and Peyton have made mission work familiar even to ordinary people. But though books were scarce, they did have readers. One such book came into Horden's hands and, under God's guidance, shaped his future. It described India and the terrible superstitions there. After reading it, Horden decided on his life's work. He would become a missionary to India, taking the gospel to those trapped in those cruel beliefs. Resolutions like this are easy to make and easy to forget, but Horden held to his. He had not made his decision in a moment of excitement. He truly meant it. Still, he could not act alone. He had to consider his family, and his father strongly opposed the plan. It is easy to criticize Mr. Horden for blocking such a noble goal, but we must remember the times. Missionaries were not common then, and the Church in England was still only beginning to take up its duty to the non-Christian world. John Horden met the same kind of resistance that many missionaries of that era faced. In the end, this opposition actually worked for his good. It led to Horden becoming better prepared for his life's work than if he had gone straight into mission training at the beginning. When John Horden left school, he was apprenticed to a trade, and, as an honest Christian young man, he worked at it with energy and skill. This gave him a quickness with manual work, skill with tools, and an ability to make the best of poor materials. Abilities that would later serve him better than a formal seminary education ever could. But while he worked with his hands, he never forgot his great ambition. In his spare time, he kept studying, working hard at Greek and Latin, which he knew he would need if his hopes were to come true. He did so well that when his apprenticeship ended and the chance came, he left manual labor to become a school teacher. Still, this was not because he looked down on working with his hands. Even as a bishop, he was always willing to pick up tools, not as toys, but for real, practical work. Meanwhile, his spiritual life, and with it, his missionary calling, was nurtured under the best influences. The vicar of St. Thomas's in Exeter encouraged an interest in foreign missions. At the church, there was a small group of young men who met regularly to study the Bible and gave their free time to Christian work. Horden was not alone among them in looking forward to missionary service. Until the door opened, they trained themselves for evangelism overseas by working as evangelists at home. It was the best way to keep their purpose alive. It is no surprise that 6 members of this small group eventually became missionaries. As for Horden, he was no longer a boy, but a man, when, in 1850, he was able to offer himself to the Church Missionary Society. They accepted him, and although it looked like it might be a while before he could be sent out, he was now close to reaching his goal. In fact, it was fulfilled much sooner than he could have hoped. Chapter 2. The Departure for Moosonee. For many generations of English boys, the vast lands of the far west were full of romance. Today, with railways crossing America from Atlantic to Pacific, with once isolated settlements grown into large towns, and with the noble red man almost gone, that old fascination has faded. Yet, As the continent has become better known, its sheer size is more easily understood. Horden, as we will see, went to a diocese measuring about 1,500 miles across and about 3,000 miles of coastline. And even that was just a small corner of North America. If you look on a map, you will see the great inlet called Hudson Bay, reaching deep into the continent. At its southeastern end lies James Bay. Into this bay flows a river, and on an island near its mouth stands a village known as Moose Fort or Moose Factory. As the name suggests, it was a trading post of the Hudson's Bay Company, which was the reason a small European community lived there. The post was still cut off from the world by thick, nearly impassable forests and by the frozen waters of the bay. Once a year in the 1850s, and for many years after, a ship would come from England with supplies and news. When it sailed away again, it felt as though the outside world had shut its doors. The native peoples of the region included Eskimos, Chippeways, Crees, and Ojibbeways. Today, mission stations cover the land from the United States border to the Arctic Ocean, and from Hudson Bay to the Pacific coast. But in Horden's day, much of the land was unexplored, and thousands of indigenous people had never heard the gospel. Still, Moose Fort had a few blessings. Some of the European residents were men of Christian character, and a Wesleyan missionary had worked among the native people. The field was not completely neglected, but very little had been done. In May 1851, the Church Missionary Society learned that the Wesleyans were about to withdraw from Moose Factory. Some believed the place should not be left empty, and since the Church Missionary Society was expanding its work in the Northwest, why not take over this important center on the shores of Hudson Bay? The call seemed urgent, and they decided to fill the vacancy. John Horden's chance had come. The committee decided to send a lay missionary and remembered the young Devonshire schoolmaster who had offered himself before. He seemed perfectly suited. But could he go? If so, he would have to sail as a married man, and the only ship of the year was leaving in just 2 or 3 weeks. But a true servant of Christ is always ready. On May 10th, 1851, Horden received a letter from Henry Venn, the honorary secretary of the Church Missionary Society, appointing him to Moose Factory. On May 24th, Horden left his work at the school. On May 25th, he was married. On May 28th, he left for London on his way to the mission field. It was not as rushed as it sounds. When Horden first offered himself to the Church Missionary Society, he had already become engaged to Miss Elizabeth O'Kay, a member of the same congregation who shared his desire to be a missionary. She, too, had prepared for mission work by serving at home. When the call to Moosonee came, the decision rested with her. Without hesitation, she agreed to go, and their quick wedding began a married life that would be both long and happy. Horden and his wife boarded their ship at Gravesend on June 8, 1851. The voyage was slow and uneventful, but the time was not wasted. The young missionary believed his message was not only for Indians and Eskimos. He acted as chaplain on board, beginning the consistent Christian witness that would win him respect all his life. He also studied the language he would need and learned to play the accordion to help brighten worship with the natives. Mrs. Horden, too, was active. One passenger was from Hudson Bay Territory, and Mrs. Horden found in her a first pupil. On July 26th, Horden recorded in his diary their arrival at the entrance of Hudson Bay. His own words paint a vivid picture of the land before him.
The sun shone very brightly in the morning, and we saw several large icebergs. In the afternoon, the atmosphere became very thick and cold. All felt as though it were winter in July. About 6, the mist almost instantly cleared, and the sun came out, and land was visible. Yes, we had entered the straits, Resolution being to our right, a barren, bleak, but lofty and majestic shore, while on our left lay an immense field of ice, stretching for miles. We passed thousands of pieces of every shape and size, some like churches, others like hills, valleys, mountains, or houses. It was amusing to hear the sailors naming the different pieces, this one a certain head, that one a ship's hull, and so on.
Horden went on to describe the journey up the bay, with its dangers from ice, fog, and storms, which made the yearly arrival of the ship an anxious event. The slow progress, constant watchfulness, shifting hopes and setbacks, and the need to endure hardness were a preparation and a symbol of the challenges he would soon face in his spiritual work. Here are 3 entries from his voyage.
August 10th. Surrounded by ice, atmosphere very thick. It fell calm about tea time, and we anchored to a very large piece of ice, filling our water tanks. When the ice opened and a good breeze sprang up, we sailed about 7 through thick ice. After a few miles, we were again stuck, and for 4 hours gained nothing. August 11th. We anchored to a large piece of ice at 4 a.m. It rained or snowed nearly all day. The wind blew hard but did not open the ice. Some of us went onto the ice piece we were fastened to. It was about 2 miles around. August 12th. About 3 a.m. we loosed from the ice, and after sailing 6 miles in 5.5 hours, had to anchor again because the ice was so heavy and close. In the evening, the men had fun playing football on the flat ice.
The ship was trapped in the ice for a week before finally moving forward. At last, on August 23rd, they anchored in the outer Moose Roads, about 40 miles from the fort. 3 days later, Horden reached Moose Fort, which, from then on, would be the center of his life's work until he died. The first sight of the place and its people left a vivid impression on Horden's mind. His diary, which became his first letter to the Church Missionary Society, gives a clear summary.
On reaching the fort, which stands on a rather large island, we began to see wigwams, houses, and people. First, we saw 3 Indian boys in flannel coats playing on the beach, then a house, then many Indian wigwams, and the old factory and stores. A bit farther on the same side of the river, stood a neat little church with a proper tower, and beyond that a few Indian tents. After dinner, we visited almost everyone on the island, including nearly 150 Indians, all of whom were glad to see us.
Most of their tents were poor, but some were better, shaped like marquees. Many were dirty. The men generally wore flannel coats bordered with red, with trousers of the same cloth, though some had decent cloth coats and trousers. Some of the women wore gowns, while others had petticoats with blankets thrown over their shoulders. A contrast, this, to Devonshire. Chapter 3, First Labors Amongst Eskimo and Indians. Horden had now reached the place where he would labor, so it is worth describing more about the land and its people. His first missionary vision had been for the millions of India, but instead he was sent to an almost Arctic climate, not to the tropics, to a few scattered sheep in a true wilderness, rather than the crowded cities of India. At Moose Fort, the European was completely cut off from the outside world. Once a year, if all went well, a ship would arrive and depart, but the navigation was so dangerous that people who depended on it were always anxious. Even news about the ship traveled slowly. One year, the ship was trapped in ice in the bay, and the news reached England before it was known at Albany, only 100 miles from Moose. Inland travel was no easier. There were no roads. In summer, the birch-bark canoe was the best means of travel, though it demanded great effort. In winter, people had to rely on dog-sleds or snowshoes. Food was never abundant. Both the native people and the Europeans were familiar with scarcity and sometimes with famine. The extremes of temperature would seem shocking to anyone used only to England. In summer, the heat might reach 100 degrees, with swarms of mosquitoes adding to the misery. In winter, the thermometer could fall far below zero. A missionary in such a place needed real courage and endurance. Horden's parish was so large that he sometimes had to make journeys of 1,000 miles or more. He had to camp out, share the food of his indigenous hosts, and be prepared for anything that could happen to a traveler in a land of woods and rivers where people were few and roads did not exist. But his earlier disappointment, which forced him to learn manual labor, had strengthened his body and trained his hands and eyes. In the end, it was exactly the preparation he needed. His later experience as a schoolteacher also helped him face the serious task of teaching himself new languages and then teaching others the gospel story. Horden had one advantage that many pioneer missionaries did not enjoy. There were already Christian men and women to welcome him. The head of the Hudson's Bay Company's post warmly greeted the young missionary and his wife. Along with the few other Europeans there, he was glad to see a religious teacher arrive, both for the benefit of the white people and the indigenous community. Among the indigenous people, some had become devout Christians under the earlier Wesleyan missionary. So Horden began his work with certain advantages. From one point of view, these were especially helpful because they allowed Horden and his wife to feel at home in Moose right away. This is rare for missionaries, but for Horden, the shores of Hudson Bay became home, and England only a place to visit. As he wrote a few months before his death,
"Buried in the endless forest, the door of our grave opened but seldom.
it was a hard life, perhaps, but he added,
I doubt there being many happier communities than ours. The wheels of our little society move smoothly, and with God among us, we envy no one, and are content with our own small world."
Horden wasted no time getting to work. When he arrived, there were about 300 or 400 people in Moose, and he visited them all within hours. His next urgent task was to learn Cree, the language spoken by most of the indigenous people nearby. He began studying it systematically the very next day, with the help of a native interpreter. He prepared a short address in Cree and delivered it that same evening. He worked so hard that within a few months he could preach without help. Cree was harder for him than Greek or Latin, likely because he did not have the resources that any schoolboy would have for those languages. Yet even his first sermon brought a kind reply from an Indian woman.
I thank you for your kind words. I will keep them in my heart.
Horden's quick progress with their language and his resolve to become one of them soon won their deep affection. In 8 months, to their surprise and delight, he could preach in Cree without an interpreter. Of course, he had his share of mistakes. Once, while teaching a group of young men about the creation, he meant to say God made Eve from one of Adam's ribs, but accidentally said pipes instead, to the great amusement of his listeners. But such blunders are common for any language learner. It must not be supposed that Horden had come to a place where a missionary's life would be easy. The more he learned about the people, the more he saw how desperately they needed the gospel he had come to share. Terrible crimes were common. Men thought little of murdering their elderly parents or young children, and cannibalism happened during famines. Even a European's life was not always safe, and his property was often at risk. However, Horden himself had little reason to complain of the people. In fact, it was their affection for him that helped keep him there. The Church Missionary Society had planned to send a clergyman to Moose, while Horden would go to Red River to prepare for ordination under the Bishop of Rupert's Land. But that plan changed. Instead of Horden going to the bishop came to him. Bishop Anderson arrived at Moose after a 6-week journey, traveling 1,500 miles by lake and river to reach the remote outpost. He expected to find an inexperienced missionary, but instead found someone who already knew the people and their language. The indigenous people were distressed at the idea of losing Horden. What could be done? The bishop, seeing the situation clearly, examined Horden, ordained him both deacon and priest, left him at Moose, and arranged for the other clergymen to go elsewhere. Bishop Anderson had made a wise choice. Horden settled down with quiet determination to his work. Though cut off from the rest of the world, his labors were varied. In the winter, the village population was small, but there were always children and adults to teach. Sometimes there was building work where Horden's skill with tools was a great help, and there was always the task of translating the Bible into the people's language, a task he began early and one he continued through to his final months of life. Chapter 4. In Journeyings Often. In summer, it became possible to travel, and then the outlying stations needed attention. Posts lay between 50 and 430 miles from Moose, where groups of indigenous people gathered at certain seasons. One of the first stations Horden visited was Albany, about 100 miles north of Moose. His own words give a vivid picture of the hardships faced by a newcomer.
I started from Moose on January 5th, 1852, in a sleigh drawn by 5 dogs and accompanied by 2 Indians. After riding 8 or 9 miles, I walked for a time, but could not keep up with the dogs. We had to walk about 2 miles through thick willows on snowshoes, sinking a foot deep at every step. Being new to snowshoes, I found it very tiring, and fell 2 or 3 times, unable to rise without help, because the snow was so deep. Could you have seen me then in full winter gear, flannel and fur cap, pilot coat, scarf, mittens, and snowshoes, you would hardly have recognized the young man who once sat in your study, asking whether he truly wished to come to this country.
He spent 2 weeks at Albany, and the return journey was made with few mishaps, though he also recorded,
For 2 days the cold was intense, and our faces were frostbitten, mine only slightly, as it was quickly noticed.
Such mentions of hardship appear throughout his letters. He never exaggerated or made a fuss. Trials, struggles, and pain were all simply part of the day's work. In 1854, a severe food shortage, amounting to famine, tested the people, a danger always present. In June 1857, another threat came: a flood. Immense amounts of snow had fallen that winter, and as the ice broke up, there was deep anxiety. Horden described it.
On the night of May 21st, the noise, like distant thunder, told of the battle between the rushing water and the still solid ice, great pieces of which were sometimes thrown up in piles. Soon the alarm bell rang, warning us of danger, and some gentlemen from the factory came to guide us there, since our house was in a very exposed position. The river was now 20 feet above its usual level, with huge hills of ice 20 feet high in several places. The water kept rising, 5 feet higher still, until every house on the island, except the factory, was flooded. We later found the water had stood 5 feet 9 inches deep in my own kitchen.
Happily, although there was much damage from the flood, no lives were lost. But its effects were long felt among the indigenous people, since the rabbits they relied on for food and clothing were wiped out by the floodwaters. Another flood struck in the spring of 1860, when the wooden church under construction was lifted off its foundation and carried nearly a quarter of a mile away. That autumn, the same danger threatened again. Yet there was a brighter side to these spring floods. They meant the end of the long, dark, and difficult winter, bringing the hope of fresh food, different work, and news from faraway friends. During those harsh, frozen months, the indigenous people deeply felt the hardship of living in a barren land with so little between them and starvation. At one mission station that Horden visited early on, out of 120 indigenous people, a sixth died of hunger in one season. At that same post, one man had survived by killing and eating all 6 of his children. The barrenness of the land, so unable to provide for people, made a deep impression on Horden. During one of his journeys, he traveled 430 miles and wrote,
During the whole way, I saw no tent or house, not even a human being, until I arrived within a short distance of the post. I seemed to be passing through a foreign land.
Yet there was an even more desolate area under his care, Whale River, where some Eskimo lived. Horden visited them early in his ministry and gave them more attention in 1862. Horden, always a keen student of languages, he even picked up some Norwegian to serve Europeans at Moose, relied partly on an interpreter during this visit. That interpreter was a remarkable reminder of how one mission can help another. The young Eskimo assisting Horden had once lived on the Labrador coast and had come under the teaching of Moravian missionaries. He carried with him to Whale River some knowledge of their teaching, could speak a bit of English, remembered Bible verses, and knew some hymns. In this way, the Moravians in distant Labrador had unknowingly prepared the way for the gospel in another land. The journey to Whale River was challenging, but Horden felt well rewarded. Writing home the following year, he said,
Those 8 days were indeed blessed ones, and will not soon be forgotten by me, for they were among the most successful missionary days I have had since coming to this country.
His daily work among them went like this. At 6 in the morning he held a service for the Eskimo, where some came dressed like English working men in imported clothes, others wore traditional sealskin clothing, and one woman proudly wore an English gown. The service included both worship and teaching, with as much singing as they could manage. After this he had breakfast, then led a service for the Indians, who were less eager than the Eskimo, but generally more advanced in knowledge. When he finished with them, he became a student himself, taking a lesson from his Eskimo interpreter. Then he went visiting from home to home, mostly sealskin tents, not the ice houses people usually imagine. Afterward came a walk, then another Eskimo service, then another with the Indians, an English service for the few Europeans at the post, another lesson in Eskimo, a half-hour of social visiting, and at last,
With feelings of thankfulness at having been placed as a laborer in the vineyard of the Lord, I retired to rest.
Horden was deeply drawn to the Eskimo of Whale River. They seemed so gentle, so content despite hardships, so willing to learn, and so sincere in their new faith. During this visit, he baptized 3, 2 of whom later married. Sadly, this small church soon faced trials. Their young interpreter was drowned, and the Christian wife died. Another important part of Horden's early work in Moosonee was Bible translation. Every wise missionary hopes to place at least part of the Scriptures in the people's own language as soon as possible. Horden understood this from the beginning and began translation work at once. But even the busiest translator struggles without a printing press. While some work had been done for the mission from home, more still had to be carried out by Horden himself at Moose. To his great joy, one year, the ship brought out everything needed for a small printing office. Horden knew nothing about setting type or making impressions from it once set, but once again his early practical training proved valuable. Undaunted, he set to work learning this new skill and taught a small boy to help him. It was slow work, and so unfamiliar that some of his faithful indigenous friends worried this strange new task had made him lose his mind. But when the first 8 pages were printed, their delight was almost as great as his own. Alongside translator and printer, Horden also took up the work of a poet. Before taking his first furlough to England, he had given the Cree people the 4 Gospels, a prayer book, and a hymn book in their own language. But these labors came at a cost. Working from early to late, with so many anxieties, he found that by the time the Gospel book was complete, his strength was overtaxed.
I have felt,
he wrote,
that even a very strong constitution has limits which it may not pass without consequences.
That he wrote this from experience is easy to believe when remembering all he undertook. Besides all his other work, he learned Cree, Ojibbeway, and Eskimo for ministry among the native peoples, Norwegian to serve some of the company's staff, and Hebrew so he could one day translate the Old Testament. His efforts were not wasted. Before he took his first visit home to England, he was able to count around 1,800 indigenous people in his district who had been baptized or were preparing for baptism. Chapter 5. England Visited. The Hordens had left England in 1851, and after 13 years they wished to go home for a few months in 1864. We can agree they had earned a holiday, but it was not simply a longing for rest and change that made them return. Children had been born to them, and 3 were at an age where it was best they attend English schools. Horden planned to leave Moose on the ship of 1864 and reach England by October or November. The arrival of the ship, bringing food, clothes, goods, and news, was eagerly awaited by Europeans and indigenous people alike. Everyone expected it through August, but by the 23rd, the last possible date for its arrival, anxiety turned into despair. People feared something had happened, and they would have to survive another 12 months without it. Still, some held on to hope. September passed, and there was still no ship. In October, on the 7th, during a fierce storm, they heard the report of large guns at sea. "The ship's come!" was the cry. That night, people slept with happy expectation of seeing it in the morning. But the next day brought bitter disappointment. The guns came from a schooner sent from York Factory to deliver bad news. The Moose ship had wrecked inside the bay, and little had been saved except the letters. The ship of 1865 did better, though it had been damaged by ice and needed repairs at Moose before sailing back. When it finally set out, the Hordens quickly realized this would be no easy trip. Horden described it vividly.
We left Moose with a fair wind, which carried us safely over our long, crooked, and dangerous bar. But after only half a day's sail, a heavy storm came upon us. Dangers surrounded us, with the dread of all sailing to Moose, the Gasket Shoal, ahead. Charts were frequently consulted. The captain was anxious. Sleep left his eyes. We were at the entrance of the straits. We saw land, high, rugged, barren hills. Snow lay in the valleys. Stern winter had already arrived. It looked like a place unfit even for the white bear or the walrus. What were these towering shapes appearing so formidable? They were immense icebergs carried down from even farther north through Hudson Straits into the Atlantic. The glass showed more bad weather coming, so the topsails were reefs put in the mainsail. Then the wind came upon us, roaring through the rigging, the ship plunging and creaking. Night fell with no break in the tempest. It howled and roared. It was a fearful night. One of the boats was nearly swept away, saved only with difficulty. We lost some rigging. One man was washed overboard and then back again. The sea broke over the vessel and crashed into the cabin. But one mightier had said, "Hitherto shalt thou come, and no farther." By morning, the Sabbath morning, the wind had calmed.
The voyage that began so dangerously continued to be a wearying one, but at last they reached home and were able to spend a few months among familiar scenes in Exeter. Horden's father, who had once opposed missionary work, no longer held those objections, and both parents had come to fully support their son's calling. After arranging for some of their children to attend school and enjoying a little well-earned rest, Mr. and Mrs. Horden returned to the mission field in 1867. This time they approached their isolated home from the south, traveling by steamer and rail as far as Montreal, then finishing the last 1,200 miles by canoe. For Horden himself, the journey was not too great a hardship, but Mrs. Horden had their 2 youngest children with her, and for them it was more challenging. At night, the party had to camp outdoors, and at some places the canoes had to be carried overland while everyone walked. Still, they reached their destination safely and were warmly welcomed back. They returned just in time to help their neighbors through a winter marked by severe scarcity and hardship. Horden quickly took up his old tasks again and even added a new one. A harmonium had been provided for the little church at Moose, and he began to learn to play it. Chapter 6. Outstations. Horden now began a series of missionary journeys longer than any he had yet attempted. In May 1868 he set out for a post called Brunswick House, far to the southeast near Lake Superior. The journey, made by canoe, lasted 11 days. The river was full of ice, and they were several times in real danger. Horden spent 9 days among the Indians at Brunswick House before returning home. After a few days at Moose, he was off again, this time northeast to Rupert's house. There he found about 300 or 400 Indians, many of whom had once lived in the worst practices of heathenism, but were now sincere Christian people. He stayed 2 Sundays at Rupert's house, then turned directly north along the coast of James Bay, traveling by canoe to Fort George, covering 200 miles in 4.5 days. There he enjoyed good fellowship with another group of Christian Indians led by a native teacher. Only a few days could be spent at Fort George, after which he took passage on a schooner to travel farther north to Great Whale River. But the journey nearly ended in disaster. Horden himself described it this way.
We got halfway then. As the vessel could go no farther, I left it, and with 2 native sailors went on in a small boat. 2 days brought us to an encampment of Indians. I then left the boat and entered a canoe with Keshkumash, his wife, and their young son. 2 other canoes, each carrying a man and his wife, came with us. We had to work hard. Sometimes we moved quickly. Then we were surrounded by ice and could not move at all. Again, we were chopping a path through the ice with our axes. And when nothing else worked, we carried the canoe over the rocks to place it on more open water. After 2.5 days of this, we came to a standstill, and I decided to go on foot. I took 1 Indian with me, and we set out. Our walk was over high, bare hills, crossing rivers in the valleys, which we waded.
At last, reaching his destination, Horden found himself among heathen Indians. Some accepted his message, while others did not. But he had not yet reached the farthest point north, so he pushed on to Little Whale River, where he was among the Eskimo. Only then did he turn back south. In 1870 came another round of long journeys, so hard that Horden's health suffered. He left Moose in June and traveled upriver to New Brunswick, accompanied for part of the journey by Indians who, before ever meeting a white missionary, had learned to worship God from a Christian Indian. Their worship was simple. One would recite a verse of a hymn, another would repeat a scripture verse, then more hymn verses, more scripture, and then they knelt while 6 prayed out loud at once. Meanwhile, some heathen onlookers still clung to old beliefs, one man saying he had been visited by a spirit which warned him it would no longer protect his children if he let them learn the Christian faith. From New Brunswick, Horden traveled southeast to a station called Matawakuma. There, the number of Indians was shrinking, but their love for Christ remained strong. Among them, Horden made what he called the largest comparative collection I have ever made, amounting to 8 pounds, 2 shillings, and 8 pence. Their generosity was remarkable. If they couldn't give money, they gave what they had, such as food, furs, or other useful items. At one Indian church, the congregation gave 58 beavers, valued at £8 and 14 shillings. When Horden was building a school at Moose, they also gave labor worth £20. Before he returned to England a second time, he had built 5 churches, none of which could have been completed without the willing help of these Christian Indians. Again and again he had reason to be thankful for his early training as a craftsman, which allowed him to serve not only as preacher and teacher, but also as a skilled artisan. Like Alexander Mackay, he knew he could serve God just as faithfully with hammer and chisel as when praying with a group of Indians by a riverbank, preaching in a simple church partly built by his own hands, or bringing comfort from God's promises to a dying believer. But a new responsibility was about to fall on Horden, and to prepare for it, he went to England in 1872. When he left Moose, heathenism there was nearly extinct. 12 native teachers he had trained were serving among their own people, and the number of declared Christians in his district was estimated at 1,625. Chapter 7. A New Responsibility. Horden was called to England to be consecrated a bishop. The region around Hudson Bay had previously been part of the huge diocese of Rupert's Land, but as missionary work advanced and the white population grew, it was decided to divide it. A large, irregular territory around Hudson Bay became the new diocese of Moosonee, placed under Horden's care. No better choice could have been made. He was in the prime of life and had served 21 years in the field, showing rare qualities of character and leadership. He was consecrated at Westminster Abbey on December 15, 1872. One of the bishops who laid hands on him was Bishop Anderson, the same bishop who had ordained him at Moose 20 years earlier. The new diocese was unique in that on one side it had no boundary at all. To the north, it stretched as far as one pleased. To the south, it was bordered by the Canadian Pacific Railway. East and west, it reached along the shores of Hudson Bay. The total population was perhaps 10,000, a few Europeans, some half-breeds, with Crees, Ojibbeways, Chippewyans, and Eskimo. There was not a single rich person in the diocese, and the Indians especially had many hardships to face. The population was so scattered that, as Horden described it, when he was called home this time, he had just returned from a 5-months' walk in his own parish. Bishop Horden left England in May, traveling overland once more, coming to Moose from the south. It meant more hard work, simple fare, and hard treatment from the mosquitoes, which respected a bishop no more than a curate. Of course, there was great rejoicing at the bishop's return, but Horden himself quickly settled back into daily work. He began planning for the diocese, dividing it into districts in hopes of placing a clergyman in each. He threw himself eagerly into translation work during the long days when the rivers were frozen and travel was impossible. Writing on May 5, 1874, the date of the Great Church Missionary Society meeting at Exeter Hall, he described one of these quiet days at Moose.
Outside it is very gloomy. It is still very cold. The snow is deep on the ground. The ice in the river is nearly as strong as it was in the middle of winter, and we do not expect a break-up for a fortnight, and when it comes we fear a flood. And now how shall I spend the day? Principally on my translations, which, thank God, are going very well. I am now working on the Psalms, which will be the beginning of the book I have in hand. See me then, half an hour from now, pen and ink, and manuscript book before me. Scott's commentary opened at the 90th Psalm, with Mason's Bible, a Cree dictionary, the prayer book, and Cruden's Concordance laid out around me, and I shall be deep in the beauties of that solemn psalm. At 9 I will take Bertie and Beatrice for an hour, then return to my translations until dinner time. Afterwards, I shall go out to see some of my people, especially a very aged woman, the grandmother of our schoolmaster. She has lived over a century.
Even with these responsibilities, he never forgot the ordinary life of the settlement. He helped others prepare for winter, planting a potato crop, stocking up fish, salting or freezing them, slaughtering and freezing pigs and cattle, and making sure firewood was gathered. For those in good health, there were pastimes too. The bishop's boys, like any other boys, enjoyed chopping wood and were happiest exploring the woods. They loved the thrill of rushing through the crisp air on a toboggan, which even those who had only seen Swiss sledding might envy. There was fishing, too, though it was cold work with the temperature a little below zero, so that the trout froze hard as soon as they left the water. But the bishop knew the secret of contentment, and summed up his view in these words:
The happiest man is he who is most diligently employed about his master's business.
Perhaps Horden's new dignity as bishop added weight to his words. In any case, it was soon after returning in this role that he had a curious interruption during a service. He had been traveling up the bay when he saw a group of Indians in the distance, and, as usual, he arranged a service for them. Many young people were there, and he spoke especially to them. Suddenly there was a stir among the listeners, and voices began to shout. He paused in surprise, but then understood the reason. The mothers were seizing the moment to reinforce his message.
"Do you hear? Isn't this what we are always telling you?"
Then they pulled their daughters to the front, saying,
"Come here, let him see you. Let him see how ashamed you look, you disobedient children."
Once that interlude ended, the sermon went on happily to its conclusion. For years, Bishop Horden had been training some natives to become ministers, and 2 were soon ordained by him. His own summary of his first ordination sermon shows the spirit in which he worked, and the spirit he hoped to pass on. His text was Hebrews 12, verse 2, and he outlined it like this:
Look to Jesus to learn in what spirit your work should be done. Look to Jesus and see in him how a minister of God should pray. Look to Jesus to learn how to use opportunities in your ministry. For example, when paddling with an Indian on a lake, teach him to look to Jesus who walked on the Sea of Galilee. In a lonely camp, speak of Jesus who had no place to lay his head. In a poor tent, of him who, though rich, became poor for us. Look to Jesus to learn how best to teach others. Look to Jesus in his holiness and shape your life in his perfect pattern. Look to Jesus for the fulfillment of his promises. Teach those you serve to look to Jesus.
His hearers knew that these words were truly the reflection of his own life. Chapter 8. Pages from Bishop Horden's Diary. In placing teachers for the small communities under his care, the bishop found his greatest joy. He was able to place 2 native clergy among the Ojibbeways. York Factory, an important Hudson's Bay trading post on the southwest shore, had an English clergyman, Mr., later Archdeacon, Winter. Another English minister, Reverend J.H. Keene, worked first at Moose and then at Rupert's house. Mr. E.J. Peck, who had begun life in the Navy, came out to serve among the Eskimo. Bishop Horden ordained him in 1878, and he continued faithfully in that mission. Still, the help these men offered did not make Horden less active. He labored more abundantly than they all, with the same cheerful humility. He traveled southwest to attend a synod in Winnipeg, and then, in strong contrast, went on to the northwest to visit York Factory. This showed how true the old saying was that the longest way round is sometimes the shortest way there. York Factory lay far to the northwest of Moose, on Hudson Bay, at the mouth of the Nelson River. To get there, Horden traveled almost directly south to Mattawa, then west by the Canadian Pacific Railway, pausing near Winnipeg, and then farther west by steamer and boat, before turning north through a desolate wilderness to York Factory. There, as busy as ever, he helped run an English school, for even in that lonely place the fur trade had gathered a small colony of English, while also aiding the resident missionary in learning Cree and teaching the native people. From York Factory, Horden went on to Fort Churchill, the most northern settlement in his diocese, also on the bay's shores. His diary of this journey shows what a missionary had to endure to bring Christ to the far north.
February 1st, 1880. At 4 o'clock, soon after the close of the Indian service, I drove from York Factory 8 miles through willows and woods to a house occupied by woodcutters. Temperature, 30 degrees below zero. February 2nd. After service and breakfast, we set out for Churchill. The cold was severe, and the wind so high that the guide doubted whether we could cross the Nelson River, which we reached soon after starting. It was 8 miles wide where we crossed, with rough ice piled high for most of the way. It was the most difficult traveling I have ever experienced. We had to cross far upstream compared to the route my companions had taken only a few days before, because the fierce winds had broken up the ice. After crossing safely, we traveled down the north bank of the river toward the sea. At noon, we stopped for dinner, and our guide thought it best to stay for the night. We went to Benjamin Kayamawililu's tent. He was very kind and enlarged his tent to accommodate all of us. We spent a pleasant evening, and I conducted service in English and Cree. Temperature, 27 degrees below zero. We had 2 carrioles, 2 sledges for baggage and food, and 16 dogs. February 3rd. After prayers and breakfast, we resumed our journey for a short time through woods and then over more open country. The wind was high and cold, and the drifting snow forced us to stop after 12 o'clock. We camped comfortably at Island Bluff. Temperature, 23 degrees below zero. February 4th. Bitterly cold, with a sharp wind blowing straight in our faces. We traveled over plains broken by belts of trees and encamped between 1 and 2 o'clock at Partridge Creek. Temperature, 30 degrees below zero. February 5th. The cold was even more severe, the wind still right against us. We could not go on after 11 o'clock and camped at the edge of Stony River Plain. Except for myself, all were frostbitten. The guide and James Isaac, my attendant, very badly. Temperature, 36 degrees below zero. February 6th. No improvement, but we were forced to move on as food for both men and dogs was running low. Crossing the large plain was terrible, and all suffered greatly. At 3 o'clock, we camped at Owl River. Temperature, 38 degrees below zero. February 7th. Today brought very bad weather, with a high, cold wind, some snow, and much drifting. We could not continue after 11 o'clock and camped at the edge of the big plain. The Indians killed 2 deer today. Temperature, 32 degrees below zero. February 8th. We started late and at once faced the plain. Looking across it, one might have imagined seeing the frozen surface of the sea. No trees or bushes broke the endless white. Over it we jogged as quickly as possible. Riding in a carriole over such a surface is no pleasure. Instead of a sense of swift movement, it feels like traveling slowly on a rough road, more like riding in a springless cart on a rugged country lane. The snow lay in ridges, hardened by the wind, and the carriole jolted over them constantly. At 11 o'clock, we reached Buak and went no farther, as it was terribly cold. Temperature, 46 degrees below zero. February 9th. We started early. The weather was not quite so cold. At 2 in the afternoon, we reached the south end of a belt of woods called Robinson's Bluff. It began snowing heavily, and as there was good wood here, we camped for the night. Temperature, 28 degrees below zero. February 10th. The weather was somewhat better, and we made good progress, camping in the evening among the eastern woods. Temperature, 31 degrees below zero. February 11th. A fine day, bright and cold, without wind. We crossed several plains and small lakes, passing through some belts of woods. At noon, we stopped for dinner at Statchookum Ridge, about 15 miles from Churchill, and there made a good smoke signal of our approach. 8 miles farther on, we made another smoke, and soon were met by men from the post, who brought a team of dogs so the doctor could go on ahead more quickly with fresh dogs and drivers. We then descended 2 miles through a wood to the bank of the Churchill River, here 4 miles wide. The crossing was rather rough because of the ice, though not nearly so bad as on the Nelson River. At 4:30, I arrived at Churchill House, where Mr. Spencer, the Hudson's Bay Company agent, and his wife gave me the warmest of welcomes. That evening, I held a service attended by everyone at the post. Temperature 30 degrees below zero. The temperatures I have noted are those recorded at York Factory, but the actual cold we experienced on the journey would be at least 2 degrees worse because of our exposure and the fact that we were moving northward. Each evening, we spent an hour to an hour and a half building our barricade, which took much care. We cleared the snow down to the ground, then raised a wall of pine trees with the branches on about 4 feet high to protect us from the wind. A little distance in front of that, we made the fire and covered all the space between the wall and the fire with pine brush, which served as both carpet and bed. The amount of firewood cut was enormous. A small fire, not constantly fed, would have been useless against air 40 degrees below zero. Cooking and taking supper took time, and afterward we often heard a story from one of our companions about traveling or hunting, showing great courage, endurance, and self-reliance. We ended every night with a short service in which everyone joined wholeheartedly, and each morning before starting, we had another. I was treated with the greatest kindness by all. Even my smallest wish was carried out, if it had not already been anticipated. All were willing, all were cheerful. Not one angry look or word was exchanged on the whole journey.
Churchill is not a place any European would choose as a home unless duty called them there. Its cold is believed to be as intense as almost anywhere on earth, and the isolation is so extreme that the wife of the Hudson's Bay Company agent was often years without seeing the face of a civilized woman. This is hardly surprising, since the land endures 8 months of continuous winter with only about 6 weeks of true summer. Yet even there, Bishop Horden was able to place a resident missionary with so much blessing that in recent years nearly all the adults have regularly gathered at the Lord's table. A few sentences from a recent letter show that barren though the land may appear, it has borne good fruit before God.
Constant and regular attendance at all services is some proof of a desire to serve Christ at Churchill. For I am quite sure there are many real Christians in England whose place in the house of God would often be vacant, if they had such a church as we had last winter. It was no uncommon thing to see minister and congregation covered with snow, and often I have gone through the full service with the thermometer far below freezing, yet all were as reverent and devout as if in a comfortable English church. Thank God, we have now got our new church opened and in use, so I hope we may escape rain and storm, though to get the church fairly warm, with the thermometer 50 degrees below zero, needs good fires and good wood. And good wood is impossible to get at Churchill.
The bishop's letters from this period include many testimonies to the character and faithfulness of the Christian Indians, both men and women. The so-called noble red man does not always appear, in fiction or in fact, with true nobility of character. Yet under the gospel of Christ, men and women who once had killed their own relatives to save themselves from starving were turned into genuine heroes. One such was Eliza, whose story Bishop Horden often told. Here is how he recorded it in a letter after her death.
When I came to Moose 35 years ago, among my first scholars was a young Indian girl named Eliza Crow. She was very industrious in her studies and soon learned both to speak and to read English, and her Bible quickly became her greatest delight. Later, the family she lived with was sent far into the interior to run a trading post, and she went with them. There she married a Christian Indian who worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. Leaving that work, they moved to Albany, his home, living by fur hunting. One winter, they hunted on the island of Ogibbeway, the land on the other side of the water. Food grew scarce until their two youngest children died of starvation. Albany was 70 miles away, the nearest place where help could be found. Eliza tied her two remaining children, a boy and a girl, warmly on her sledge, and with her husband, already weak from hunger, began the terrible journey. They struggled on until her husband collapsed from exhaustion. She made a small tent, lit a fire, and made him as comfortable as she could, then pushed on alone with her children, reaching the settlement and fainting away. When she could speak, her first concern was for her husband, begging help for him at once. Dogs were harnessed and supplies sent instantly. They found the tent, but help was too late. He was dead, cold and starved. His body was buried, and the men returned to Albany. The next summer, Eliza came on to Moose, where she supported herself and her children through her industry. She later married Norman Martavela, a European, to whom she was a faithful wife, and they had 4 children whom she raised well. Her last illness was long, but she bore it patiently. As the end came, she was eager to go, saying her Savior was waiting for her. She died in peace and was honored by all at Moose. She will live long in our memories.
This story of battling hunger was, sadly, all too common in Indian life. Another woman, Amelia, lost her husband in the same way, trying to reach help. In the midst of her misery, she gave birth to a child and managed to carry the baby alive to Moose. There was the wife of Jacob Matamashkum, who saved her husband from starvation by giving him the milk meant for her own child. "In the summer," wrote the wife of a native pastor at one station, "we depend altogether on our nets, and if fish fails, then there is nothing at all." There are people in England who sometimes question whether Christianity is of any real value to these Indians. But the contrast between the heathen who, in time of famine, saved himself through cannibalism, and the Christian who showed the courage and faith of women like Eliza and Amelia is worth serious thought. The bishop went back from Churchill to Fort York, and from there, by the annual ship, returned to England for a time of rest after his first 8 years of service as a bishop. Chapter 9. Years of Trial. Bishop Horden returned to Moosonee in 1882. Friends in England had noticed how much he had changed since his last visit, and even those who had never met him before this time could see that he was physically less able to endure the long, tiring journeys, the extremes of heat and cold, and the hardships that lay ahead. But at Moose, the one thought was their joy to have him back. He again traveled by the southern route. The progress of the Canadian Pacific Railway was already transforming the lower part of his diocese. When he last passed through Mattawa, it had consisted of just 3 houses. Now it was a thriving little town. But the railway could not carry him north to Moose, and once more in the canoe he began to feel the weight of his years. Still, his courage did not fail. In his diary, he wrote of his delight at meeting his people again, the excitement of a few moose folk who met him along the river, the joyful commotion when news of his arrival spread by voice, flag, and bell, and the church service that was quickly arranged. There had been progress during the bishop's absence, but also many troubles. In the summer of 1883, whooping cough broke out at Moose and Albany. At Albany, 44 people died out of the small community, and Moose suffered badly as well. Then, in August, a severe storm caused heavy damage at Moose and added to the gloom, for the annual supply ship was due. September came, day after day, passing without the ship's arrival. After a season of great hardship, the thought of Christmas, without the expected supplies, filled all with dread. Medicines were gone, candles nearly finished, only half a potato crop remained, and clothing was running short. It was not until September 21st that the joyful cry went up, "The ship's come!" The worry weighed so heavily on Horden, and the danger of another shipwreck was so serious, that he decided to store up a full year's supply of necessities for all the stations to lessen the risk of starvation. The money was raised, and the yearly fear of running out was gone. But there were still more sorrows to face. The year 1884 brought much sickness and distress, which had to be fought on every side. Early in the summer, the bishop traveled up the Moose River to Long Portage House. It was the kind of work that tried him now. The canoe journey was hard and the weather too cold for camping. Yet he was rewarded by the joy of ministering to the small group of people there. On the journey out, they met just one family in 5 days. On the return, they came across a few Indians, stopped immediately, and held a service lasting 3 hours. The bishop went to camp at 10:30 and was up and in the canoe again by 4. That September, he had only just returned from this hard journey when news came that influenza was raging at Albany. He set off again, traveling another 100 miles. His presence was desperately needed. The epidemic was threatening to sweep away the whole community, striking especially hard at the young men. There were 5 funerals in one day, as many as usually happened in a whole year.
To make matters worse,
Wrote the bishop,
the weather was terrible. It rained almost every day, and there was no suitable food. There was plenty of flour, salt pork, and salt geese, and these were shared freely. But in the summer, there are no birds in the Albany marshes, no fish in the Albany River, as the Indians say. It is poor. Truly, it is very poor.
Horden's coming gave everyone new hope. Compared with them, he was healthy and full of the bright, trusting faith they had seen him show many times before in hardships. He was everywhere, distributing medicine and food, comforting the dying, burying the dead, encouraging those left behind, and giving the recovering simple tasks to help them regain strength. After 5 weeks of this work, he was able to head home again, leaving not one Indian seriously ill behind him. At Rupert's house, too, sickness and death had struck. It had been one of the happiest settlements, with Indians who had all accepted the gospel, living faithfully, orderly, and with enough to eat, rarely threatened by starvation. But now Horden found everything changed. Terrible suffering had come upon them, like that usually seen in poorer places.
Now,
Wrote the bishop in his annual letter,
I looked around and asked, where is this Indian? Where is that one? What became of this child's father? Where is this child's mother? And the answer came, he died of starvation 4 winters ago. He starved to death 3 years since. She and the rest of her children died 2 years ago. And what losses were suffered last winter. And I was told 4 men, 3 women, and 19 children. They were all baptized Christians.
Once, while returning from Rupert's house, the bishop nearly lost his life. They were crossing part of the bay on a dog sleigh, nearly 10 miles from land, when they saw the ice breaking up before the tide. One of the men struck the ice near them with a stick, and it went straight through. They turned at once, and by God's mercy reached Rupert's house safely. The next disaster was the wreck of the annual ship, the Princess Royal. Thankfully, it happened on her return voyage, but the crew were forced to stay for months as prisoners at Moose. The autumn of 1885 was also hard because the weather stayed warm when it should have turned cold. This was especially difficult for those living on Moose Island.
We can generally,
He wrote,
cross the main channel of our river about November 10th on the ice, while this season we could not do so until just a few days ago. This is no advantage to us, since most of our firewood and a good portion of our food must be fetched from across the river, and we are stuck on the island until the river is firmly frozen. As it was, it lay for weeks quite impassable, with too much ice to travel by boat or canoe and too little for sledges or snowshoes.
But even in the middle of these worries, Horden still noticed the beauty of nature. In one letter, he described how the forest had been turned into a wonderland, in a way he had never seen before.
A light rain fell for several hours,
He wrote,
and froze the moment it touched the houses, trees, and bushes. The windward sides of the houses were covered with countless tiny icicles hanging from the edges of the weatherboards. The trees, especially the poplars, were thickly coated with ice, every branch looking as if it had been cased in clear glass. The bushes, nearly flattened by the weight of their icy beauty, looked strange and wonderful. Then, a few days later, a fine snow, or more like frozen mist, fell on top of this glassy covering, making the whole scene look the most fairy-like you could imagine. Walking through the forest, one might almost have expected to meet elves or fairies, like those we heard about in childhood stories. But this beauty was very destructive. The trees could not bear the unusual weight, and many branches kept breaking off, so it was even dangerous to walk underneath them. Many of the bushes were completely destroyed. The birds and animals must have suffered terribly, for they could find no food. Even the blades of grass above the snow were as thick as ropes of ice. Things are improving now, though they are still not quite back to normal.
At the end of that same year, the bishop made another journey to Albany. His account, published in England the following April, shows all his old gift for vivid description. It helps us understand the life Horden still loved to live. They set out on December 18th after breakfast. With his faithful fellow workers, he walked to the Hudson's Bay Company's post, where the sledge was ready on the river.
Soon the dogs, 12 in number, as fine a team as I ever saw, were brought down the bank and each tied to the sledge, which was firmly moored to keep them from running off too soon. I said goodbye to the many friends gathered to see me off, while the dogs jumped and howled and strained at their traces in eagerness to be gone. At last the mooring rope was cast loose, and away we flew, galloping down the river, past the houses on its north bank, the people cheering us onward. Within half a mile we passed the last house and were soon deep in the wilderness, out of sight and sound of everyone except ourselves. For a while, between the islands, the ice was rough, broken by the currents and the tides, but after that the running became as smooth as any traveler could wish. The temperature was delightful. No wrapping up was needed. It was perfection, and I felt a lightness of spirit I had long missed. After 14 miles, we saw the wreck of the Princess Royal, lying 6 miles from shore, and soon reached North Bluff Beacon. There we rested half an hour to give the dogs a break and take a little refreshment ourselves. Then on again. The splendid dogs, tails curled over their backs, needed no whip, but galloped or trotted steadily all the way to our camp at Pisquamisk. We had done 40 miles in a little over 6 hours, one of the best and most pleasant journeys I have ever had. We quickly made ourselves comfortable, then looked to the comfort of our hard-working animals, removing their harness, chaining each to a separate stump to prevent fighting, spreading them a bed of pine brush, and giving them a good supper of frozen whitefish. When they had devoured this and saw there was no more, they curled up with their tails over their noses and fell into perfect silence for the night.
The next day the weather turned rough, the air so thick they could see nothing seaward, so they stayed in camp and spent most of the day reading. On the third morning the weather was still poor, but they had only a short stage ahead to Cock Point, where it was essential to get food for their dogs.
4 hours took us there,
He wrote,
and 6.5 hours the next day brought us to Albany, where I found all well.
Chapter 10. To England for the Last Time. The coming of summer in 1886 brought fear and danger to the people at Moose. The ice broke up earlier than ever known before. On April 16th, an Indian came to warn the settlement that the ice was rotten. 4 days later, from 6 miles away, the ice could be seen piled up in high mounds. Big guns were fired to warn any Indians hunting near the river mouth. There was no immediate change, but at 3 o'clock the next morning, the crash came.
There was a roar like heavy artillery. The ice broke right across the river and began to heave and plunge, and a great body of it moved downstream. A huge field of ice, rising above the riverbank, rushed forward as if it would destroy the mission buildings, but stopped just a few feet from my front gate, and all became quiet again. The river, jammed with piled and broken blocks of ice, looked wild and threatening, and we waited anxiously to see what the next tides would bring. The water ebbed and flowed, and sometimes there was more movement, but no cause for alarm until 11 o'clock that night, when the water rose very high and the ice was carried forward with great force, pushing the field of ice right up to our fence, with the water lying deep in my garden.
All that summer the bishop stayed busy. He continued his translation work, trained new teachers, and carried out the daily work of preaching and shepherding. In the middle of it all, he still found time to write long letters for publication back in England, knowing that to keep people interested in the mission, they needed to hear real stories, how the work was going and how the people were living. So he taught himself to share not only spiritual victories, but the details of everyday life among the Indians. In one of his letters, Bishop Horden gave a vivid and often humorous description of Fort Churchill, calling it the last house in the world, the nearest place to the North Pole with permanent settlement. He even described its 3 famous cows, kept alive through the long winters by feeding on the white moss that reindeer love. These cows were quite a sight. One was tiny, like a dwarf. Another was so flexible she practically milked herself. And the third had an artificial tail. After a wolf bit her real tail off, a replacement from a dead cow was attached with canvas and tar so she could survive the terrible summer flies. In another letter, Horden wrote about the dogs of the North, especially the Eskimo teams, whose value in winter could hardly be overstated. When some men arrived hauling their own sledges instead of using dogs, the Moose people were puzzled, until they learned the visitors' dogs had died of an epidemic, forcing the men to pull their load themselves. Horden said that pure Eskimo dogs were used at all the mission stations: Albany, Rupert's House, Whale River, York, and Churchill. He especially praised the Albany team, which was carefully bred and kindly treated by their driver, George Oman, who cared for them as if they were his own children. They were never beaten without cause and were given good food and a warm place to sleep each night. In summer, however, these dogs became a nuisance, dangerous to the calves, so they had to be chained up, which made them sulky. But in winter they were busy hauling provisions, goods, and even firewood, working hard for the whole community. The bishop described how at Whale River the dogs carried all the firewood for the mission station from 7 miles away, while at York they hauled loads of venison from hunters, and at Churchill they were just as valuable. Horden noted the Eskimo dogs could be playful and gentle, but also fierce and brutal to each other. They could switch from behaving like friendly kittens to acting like a pack of wolves, fighting viciously, even killing one another. Most of the time they were not dangerous to people, but on occasion they attacked humans and caused serious injuries. Now the time had come for Bishop Horden's final departure for England. It was deeply moving for everyone at Moose. Mrs. Horden had remained in England since 1882, and after years apart, it was time for him to reunite with her, though in his heart Moosonee was still home. He began his journey on May 31st, 1888, after a farewell Sunday that was full of solemn emotion.
"Everyone at Moose is to me as a son or a daughter,"
he wrote. The day began with an English service attended by 200 people, though only 6 were Europeans. 40 received communion, and the offering amounted to £35. He also ordained Mr. Richards, a remarkable man who could preach well in English, Cree, Ojibbeway, and even manage a bit of Eskimo, besides handling a canoe like a native. After that came a 7 a.m. service for the Indians, who brought their own Bibles and prayer books bought with their own hard-earned money. The Sunday school met at 1:30, and the cathedral was again filled at 3:30 for a final crowded service where every adult present had been baptized and confirmed. That collection reached £20. At last, the moment of parting came. As the bishop boarded his canoe, he gave a fatherly blessing to the crowd on shore. His daughter and her children traveled with him for a day, and a grandson went with him as far as Canada. That night, they camped on the riverbank, cooking supper by a roaring fire and closing the day with a solemn service. The journey itself was far from easy. The canoe had to be poled and tracked up the river, and sometimes they had to leave it behind and walk through the thick woods. At one critical point, they faced a deadly danger.
We had ascended a terrible and long rapid, and had got by the easiest side of the stream just opposite the foot of our longest portage. But between us and it ran the swollen and fiercely flowing river. We all grasped a paddle firmly, and bending with our full strength, dashed out into the stream. We could get no farther, and were swept down like lightning into the boiling rapid. The sight was the most dangerous I had ever witnessed, but the men were equal to the emergency. Turning round the canoe, the bow became the stern, and we were kept clear of the rocks which threatened our destruction.
The voyage to Canada was safely completed, and soon Bishop Horden was back in England. But it was not a time of rest or ease for him. He had much to do in spreading news of the mission and asking for support to expand its work further. At the Church Missionary Society anniversary in 1889, he was a prominent figure. Warmly welcomed, he appeared with other bishops on the platform at Exeter Hall in the morning and presided over the meeting in the evening. Few who heard his speech would ever forget him. He told the vast audience that he had come from the great Lone Land, where he had spent 38 years of his life. In a vivid story, he reminded them of what the Indians had once been, then contrasted that with the faith and Christian life he had seen among them on his last Sunday in the diocese. A few days later, Bishop Horden said farewell to his friends in England, turning his back on scenes he would never see again. Chapter 11. Home Again. Bishop Horden traveled again by way of Canada, and true to his nature, he spent the railway journey westward, lecturing each day to those around him. He first visited the northwest part of his diocese, going to Oxford House, then on to York Factory. He called it a pleasant week's journey, though few men his age would have found it so. From York Factory, he traveled by boat to Churchill. The weather was bright and beautiful every day, but the nights were very cold, and sleeping in the open boat, as the bishop admitted, was not always comfortable. Still, he added, that mattered little as long as we were proceeding. In 5 days they were sailing up the great Churchill River and landing at the very edge of civilization. The place was bustling, and as busy as the swarms of mosquitoes that made the short summer hard for both man and beast. After a few days he returned to York, then continued by schooner back to Moose. It was dark when he arrived after this last absence, but crowds were gathered on the beach to welcome him. There he was, really at home, and felt so overjoyed and so thankful. From Moose, he traveled on to Rupert's house, spending Christmas and the following spring there. It was a hard time for the people, as the goose harvest failed and brought much suffering. Goose hunting was vital, yet this year geese were scarce, shy, and many starved in the deep snow. 18 Indians in one party died of hunger. As summer came, the bishop again set out on his travels, this time to the north. He visited East Main River and ministered to a group of Indians who rarely saw a clergyman. Then he went to Fort George and farther north to Great Whale River. It was a wonderful proof of the thorough spread of the gospel that while traveling along the bay's coast, they came upon a group of Eskimo who were Christians. The bishop gathered with them at once and heard them read from their books. Only one woman was behind the rest, and for her they made excuses. She had only just received her books, but they were teaching her daily. Horden, who had always cared deeply for the Eskimo, was filled with joy at their eagerness to learn. That Christmas was spent at Moose. Bishop Horden made sure the school children had something close to the treat children in England enjoyed. There was tea, cake, and a Christmas tree filled with gifts. The following summer brought much sickness. Influenza broke out again, and at Rupert's house the bishop had to act as doctor, nurse, and pastor all at once. He himself fell ill and recovered his strength only slowly. In August, an important visitor arrived at Moose. Horden had long felt that with his advancing age and declining health, the time had come to pass his work on to someone younger. In the Reverend J. A. Newnham, who would later become Bishop of Moosonee, he believed God had sent the right man. Horden was happy in this, but chose to stay on a bit longer to help instruct his successor and to finish his translation of the Bible into Cree. That Christmas he spent at Albany with Archdeacon Vincent. It was a tiring journey, and he reflected on how things had changed.
I was then,
He wrote,
remembering his first visit there 40 years before, young and active, and thought nothing of hardship. I could sleep in the open, bivouac under the cold, bright sky, with the thermometer at 40 degrees below zero.
But, he added sadly,
They tell me that for the future, winter traveling must not be indulged in.
yet he comforted himself.
We must bow to the inevitable. We cannot always be young. The halting step and the gray head will come. And why should we dread their approach when we know that if the earthly house of our tabernacle be dissolved, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens?
That winter was mild in weather, but cruel in another way, for influenza again raged among the people. By the following May, the bishop reached the final words of his translation of the Bible into Cree. He still hoped to revise it thoroughly, and that hope was never far from his mind. Yet at this time he could still travel to visit his distant flocks. One of his last long journeys was to Whale River. The account of his visit there gives a striking picture of how the gospel had transformed native life. He was eagerly welcomed and immediately began work. Here was his Sunday schedule. The first service was at 6:30 in the morning for the Indians. All were present, including men he had not seen for years. After that came breakfast. Then he held a service for the Eskimo.
You see before you,
He wrote,
a goodly number of clean, intelligent-looking people, short and stout. You see that they have books in their hands, and notice that they readily find out the places required. They sing very nicely.
That is not the picture many people might have of the Eskimo, but the gospel had truly changed them. After dismissing the Eskimo, it was time for dinner. Then he held a second Indian service, really a group of services in one. There he married 4 couples and baptized 12 children. In scattered communities like this, people had to be ready for such events whenever the missionary came. But these Indian brides, he observed, likely did not worry much about fancy wedding clothes, so even a few hours' notice caused no alarm. After those services, the bishop had a bit of leisure, just enough time for a short walk in the fresh air, welcome after the somewhat close atmosphere inside. Then came tea, simple but satisfying, with bread, preserved milk, sugar, and, instead of butter, marrow fat. In the evening there was another service, this time in English. Horden often mentioned these English services in his letters as a reminder that in lonely places like Hudson's Bay, there were also English-speaking settlers whose only chance for worship came from the missionary. Only those cut off for months at a time from any such opportunity could really understand what joy it was to gather, even if only 2 or 3 were present, to worship Christ together. Afterwards came a little conversation, and then bed. At 6 the next morning the bishop was already back at work, holding a final service before saying farewell to the people whose faces he knew he would never see again. Chapter 12. Closing Scenes. Yet in that autumn, while busy with his translation work, Horden was struck down by rheumatism. He described the attack himself in a letter, written from his sick room just a week before his death.
My translational work I divided into 2 parts. In the morning of almost every day, I worked on revising my Cree New Testament, and every afternoon my much-valued Indian assistant sat with me as we carefully examined all my last winter's translations from Joshua to Esther. This is now nearly completed, and I hope it will be entirely finished long before this letter leaves Moose. I continued on my New Testament work until November 21st, when my pen dropped from my hand, and I have not touched it since. I had finished the Gospels of St. Matthew and St. Mark, and 11 chapters of St. Luke. The day before, I had felt perfectly well. I had preached at the English service from Malachi 3:14-17. I had taken my large class at the Indian school and then preached at the Indian service from Jeremiah 23:5 on a greater deliverance than that from Egypt. On Monday, I arose quite well and strong before daylight, and at 7:15 I sat down to write, beginning the 12th chapter of St. Luke. I worked steadily for a quarter of an hour when I received what seemed to me a terrible blow on the lower part of my back. I thought it was a stroke of rheumatism and supposed it would pass off in a few minutes, but in this I was disappointed. Blow followed blow until I could scarcely move. I sat up until after prayers and breakfast, then was helped to my bedroom and put to bed. Almost at once, an automatic torture machine of the finest temper and the most exquisite sensitiveness established itself near my left hip, and at my every movement set to work with horrible intensity and regularity. What I suffered it is impossible to describe, and even if I could, it would not be understood by those who have not gone through something similar. Rheumatism and I had been companions for many years, as was to be expected, from the great exposure of my summer and winter journeys through the vast diocese of Moosonee, with the thermometer ranging from 100 degrees in the shade to 50 degrees below zero. I had suffered in back, legs, feet. I had been so bad at times I could not walk down the stairs, and when attacked by my painful companion out of doors, I often had to use all my willpower to keep from being thrown down on the snowy road. All these things I did not mind much. I could bear pain, and they did not interfere much with my work, and as long as that could go on, I was content. But now it was different. With increased pain came inability to work, and for a week I lay almost unfit for anything. I seemed for a while to make progress toward recovery, and 3 weeks after the attack was able to walk from my bedroom to my study with a little help. Then a relapse came, and I have scarcely been out of bed since, and when I shall again, God alone knows. But he has been very, very good. He has kept me in peace. He has kept me in fairly good bodily health, and given me as much cheerfulness as I ever had. Our young doctor has worked tirelessly for my recovery. He has rubbed and kneaded me, mustard-plastered and blistered me, until my whole left leg shows the results of his care. I was to have gone to Winnipeg in the coming summer, and then finally return to England after my long service. At present, I see no way to make that journey, since before reaching the railway there is more than a fortnight's hard work up one large river, with many rapids and falls and frequent portages, which is utterly beyond me now. I suppose I shall have to return home by the annual ship, but I dread this much, as there is no accommodation on board, especially for one in my condition. I know they would do their best to make me as comfortable as possible, for I meet with nothing but kindness from everyone connected with the Hudson's Bay Company. I need not trouble myself much about this. I can trust all to the hand of God. He will provide what he deems sufficient for my case.
This letter was never finished. Mrs. Broughton added this postscript.
January 24th. Since the above was written, my dear father, the Bishop of Moosonee, has passed away. He died quite unexpectedly on the morning of January 12th.
In a later letter, Bishop Newnham described the bishop's final hours. Early in January, Horden had felt somewhat better, but in the second week of the month signs of weakness returned and the doctor became worried. On the night of January 11th, all except the doctor went to bed, hoping to see improvement in the morning. The doctor stayed up until 1 a.m. and came back at 5. By 8 o'clock, the bishop was so weak that his daughter and son-in-law were called to his room, but before they arrived he had peacefully passed away from heart failure. As he lay in his coffin, people of all ages came to look one last time upon the man who had lived among them for 40 years. A young Indian, whom Horden had taught for years, described the funeral.
Saturday, January 21st. We had the funeral. The coffin was closed in the presence of 4 clergy. It was a lovely afternoon, almost spring-like, when the beautiful burial service was read, and the first bishop of Moosonee's body was committed to the grave before his grieving people. The whole adult population went to the church and to the grave. There he was laid among his flock, as he had wished to be. While still lying in the church, young and old came to say the last farewell to the face they loved so well, the one who had been in and out of their homes for 40 years as a missionary, pastor, friend, and bishop.
Horden's grave lies beside those of a daughter and a grandson. So ended 42 years of service in a land of many hardships, but also many triumphs. When his successor took over, the diocese was fully organized, with 1 native clergyman, 26 native lay teachers, and nearly 3,600 baptized native Christians. The Bible was in their hands, along with other books, and this work under God was chiefly Horden's. In Exeter Cathedral, the town of his birth, a monument was raised to honor him. Another memorial stands at the school where he first decided to become a missionary. A simple inscription tells the main facts of his life, ending with these words, "Faithful unto death." You have finished listening to Hudson Bay Mission, Missionary John Horden's 42 Years Among the Cree and Eskimo. Visit scrollreader.com to purchase a physical copy of this book or to listen to more free audiobooks.